A kite is a quadrilateral. What's a quadrilateral? Four-sided figure. Okay, so a kite is a four-sided figure with two pairs of consecutive sides. What's consecutive? Next to. Okay. Consecutive sides that are congruent. And no opposite sides congruent. So the sides across from each other cannot be congruent on these, okay? Consecutives are congruent for one pair and then the other pair, but nothing across from each other can be congruent. So if you look at this picture, basically a kite is two next to each other congruent and the other two next to each other congruent. If you want to really make it look like a kite. Put a little tail on it.
Oh my gosh, guys.
Okay, so that's one way you can see it. It doesn't always have to sit vertically, I guess, if you will. You can have a kite that looks like this also.
That looks like one of those sea animals, the thing.
The stingray?
Yeah.
Oh, a manta ray or something. Okay, so that is that setup. This is where, remember how we had a random floating kite in our last lesson? It was supposed to be here. Draw this for me. Draw a big T and try to make it that the arms of the T are the same length on both sides. Yes, draw a cross. There you go. Draw a cross. Do that first.
Hallelujah.
Why the heck is there a cross?
Because we're going to make it a kite. Okay, so now from that, you're going to draw the kite. So connect to your endpoints. It's so much easier to draw a kite when you start with the diagonals, FYI. So if you need to draw a kite, draw the diagonals first. It is the easiest. Okay, so this one says the diagonals of a kite are blank. Anyone have a guess what happens with those diagonals? It happens in a rhombus as well. Diagonals are
They become congruent.
not congruent.
Equal.
That's congruent and equal are the same thing.
The perpendicular.
Yes, they're perpendicular.
I didn't know that congruent and equal.
Okay. So in a kite, all four of these angles will always be 90. Okay, the diagonals of a kite are perpendicular. Now, we're going to mark some angles here because some of these are equal and some are bisecting and some are not bisecting. So I want to make sure you see what is what here. Okay. The vertical diagonal, the one that goes up and down, bisects the angles. So like this angle and that angle are congruent. And same thing down here. This is congruent to that. Okay, but that is not the case on the horizontal diagonal. So if we draw that other diagonal in, there are equal angles. For instance, this one is the same as this one across the way, but it is not equal to the one right below it. Those,
Oh my gosh.
1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, those are congruent. Okay, so just notice the one that goes between the two that are congruent sides, right? So if these sides are congruent and those sides are congruent, the diagonal that cuts between those sides is the one that bisects the angles. The other one doesn't bisect angles, but you do have congruent angles across from each other. Okay, now draw a kite that doesn't have diagonals drawn in.
I'm not good at drawing.
Well, just give it your best.
I'm better at ceramics.
Doesn't have to be perfect.
I'm pretty artistic when it comes to ceramics.
Yeah,
Okay,
like my
in a kite like this now, there's no diagonals.
My toes.
2 of these angles are congruent. Any thoughts which ones those might be?
Wait, say that again?
2 of these angles are congruent. Do you think it's top and bottom, left and right, left and top? It's the left and the right. So the 2 that are joining sides that are not congruent are the 2 that are congruent. Okay?
Wait,
Um,
2 that aren't congruent are congruent?
The sides that are not congruent, where they come together, that makes a congruent angle with the side across from it. So notice 1 mark and 2 marks, the angle that meets there, so this angle, is the same as the one right across the way between the single and double mark also. Okay? Any questions on those things about a kite?
No.
Okay, then let's
Oh.
look at these.
What just happened?
I'm at 86% now.
So this is a kite, okay?
You got off class.
You can see where your congruent pieces are. Those are congruent. Those are congruent, okay? Tell me how you find the measure of angle 1.
You have to
What's
find
going
the-
on out there?
That's a bunch of crap. They did it again.
It's a different
Dude,
one. It's
that's
not
like
even-
the worst of my whole week.
That's Clearbrook Farms.
No, I hate clear.
You got a new
Where's
truck.
Got milk?
You got a new truck.
Ah, voices. What is that? Bring back got milk.
Anyway, tell me what you know about the diagonals of a kite. Forrest, be
You
quiet.
have to
Truett,
find number 1 first.
be quiet.
Got milk?
No, you have to find number 3
I
first.
saw sleeves or no?
You have to find number
You can
3,
find number 3 first.
which is 36.
3 is 36. So we know that this angle is the same as that angle. Okay, so 3 is 36.
Mhm. 190.
1 is 90. The diagonals of a kite are perpendicular. So 90, 90, 90, and 90. Guys, I would start there every time. If you see a kite and you have the diagonals are perpendicular. It will help you.
Now this is nice.
So angle 1 is 90. Angle 3 was 36. How do you find 2?
It's equal to 180.
180 with what?
90 and 36.
90 and 36.
Minus, once you do like 180 minus 36.
Minus 90. Minus 90 also, right? So 90 plus 36 plus the measure of angle 2 should equal 180 because that makes a triangle.
Yes.
Okay? So this is 126. So we're going to take that away. And the measure of angle 2 is going to be, what is that? 54. Okay? Questions on that? Mm-hmm.
I've tried
broke.
Oh, good.
My thing's like tweaking.
I've only got
Yeah,
one more.
how
year
you
to
find angle
start,
2?
Man, I'm not buying a new iPad.
Use the app for
Or all of them?
Wait, did they terminate your school email? Did they
Every
terminate
time
your
I
school
turn my
email
iPad,
after
it's
you
not
graduate?
I'm sure they give you a little bit of time to like transfer that all over. I don't know.
Exactly.
I'm assuming you're not allowed to be associated with the school anymore.
Give it to my mom.
I don't know. Okay, real quick, Max. The diagonals are always perpendicular, right? So that's how we know these are 90. So those middle angles will always be 90. Then these two angles, the 36 and 36, have to be the same because this bisects just like down here. That bisects.
Get out of my
Okay. So that's how we know that. And then this makes a triangle. So 36, 90, and 2 has to add up to 180. Let's try it again on this next one. Okay, look here.
1 equals
What is the measure of angle 1?
90.
90. These middle angles will always all be 90. So angle 1 is 90. How do you find angle 2, or what do you know about angle 2?
It's 50
Why?
because you subtract 90 and 40 from 180 and it's 50.
Okay, so 2 ways you could look at this. This angle, 40, has to be this angle, 40. So you could look at this triangle. Okay, or angle 2 is going to be this angle as well. So then you could look at this triangle. Either way, the triangle has to add up to 180. So 40 plus 90 plus the measure of angle 2 will equal 180. Okay, so take away 130. Take away 130. So the measure of angle 2 is 50.
Where did you get the 90 from again?
Diagonals of a kite are always perpendicular.
I found it.
So,
I don't have Adderall.
Go ahead, Katie.
I stopped taking Adderall
Hey,
in 7th grade.
Oh, I don't know. I'm just looking.
That stuff is terrible.
So like,
Angle 1 is 90, but since like there's more than just that one that's
Burgers?
you don't know what those angle
Is that
numbers are called,
burgers?
so it's just 90.
right, every one of these middle angles is 90 degrees. They're always perpendicular. So you can use any one of those four as 90.
Okay.
So like if we're working with a triangle, then that's helpful because that gives us one of the three angles.
Oh, Wade? No one likes Wade.
Okay?
I don't even know who Wade is. He's the NPC.
I don't know who that
Everyone
is.
wants to kill.
Like I've seen him.
Okay.
Luke Stone was like burger.
Hey, shh. So here's what I want to do. Okay? You have learned every one of these figures now.
I have not.
We're gonna, yes, you have.
I literally.
Whether or not you've
I
retained
should
it is
have,
another
but I
thing,
have
but you
not.
have learned it.
Literally, that's what
Oh my word, and you don't get to talk like that anymore. He doesn't get to make his noise, and you don't get to ditch your arse.
Not my noise.
Okay, so here it is. You have a quadrilateral. Tell me what you know about a quadrilateral.
Four sides.
It has four sides, okay? So this is our
It kind of does look like a horse.
This is our umbrella, if you will. Okay, this is our big topic, quadrilaterals. Okay, if we go, there's three directions we can go here. There is no pairs of parallel sides. There's one pair of parallel sides. Stop. And there's two pairs of parallel sides. Okay, we're gonna start on the no pairs of parallel sides because those ones are quicker. There's less information there. So zoom in on this. Okay, you've got a kite. In a kite, we know consecutive sides are congruent, so they marked that for us already. As you see it right now, which of these angles are congruent? Top and bottom or left and right?
Left and right.
Left and right. Okay, so as you see it right now, those are congruent. But if we draw the diagonals in,
Wait, is this like a problem?
this is just, we're just reviewing all the things we've said about quadrilaterals. So I'm just gonna mark up all of this so that you have it in one spot, okay? So in a kite, what do you know about the diagonals? Stop. Stop. You don't need to. What do you know about diagonals? The diagonals of a kite are
Parallel.
perpendicular. Okay, so we know these are all 90 degrees. And then we know that it bisects a pair of opposite angles. So these two angles would be the same. And these bottom angles will be the same. Write it down. Okay. The other two angles, two sets of angles, the side ones, this angle here. Okay, so the pink with this angle here, those are congruent. And then the ones below, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are congruent. Okay, so this is the only figure that doesn't have parallel sides of all the figures we talked about in this chapter, the kite. It's the only one that doesn't have parallels. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, now go to the trapezoids. The trapezoids have one pair of parallels, so these are parallel. What do you know about these two angles?
180.
They equal 180. Okay, what about these two angles?
180.
180. There's really nothing else we learned about a trapezoid by itself. Okay, you have one pair of parallels and consecutives are 180 between the parallels. Okay, but then you go to the isosceles trapezoid, and now all of this is true. So I'm not going to rewrite that. It's true of the isosceles trapezoid also. But there was something else. What else is true about an isosceles trapezoid? Its angles. What's true of its angles? The base angles are the same, right? So these angles here are the same. And these angles are the same. And then there was one more thing. What do you know about the diagonals of an isosceles trapezoid? They're equal. So if I draw these diagonals in, basically what we're saying is the little pieces equal and the bigger pieces are equal. So the whole things are equal, right? The diagonals are congruent. Okay. Last thing we talked about was when it has two pairs of parallel sides, and we call that a what? Rhombus is one of them. A parallelogram is the least specific name, okay? So in a parallelogram, here's where we got lots of things to mark up. Tell me what you know about a parallelogram. How about, let's start with opposite sides. What do you know about opposite sides of a parallelogram? They're congruent. They're parallel, right? They mark them parallel for us. That's the arrows. But they're also congruent. So this side congruent to that side. This side congruent to that side. What do you know about opposite angles in a parallelogram? So top left with bottom right. What's true of those two angles? They're equal, okay? Opposite angles are congruent. So that means this angle is congruent to that one, and this angle is congruent to that one, okay? What do you know about consecutive angles? So angles next to each other in a parallelogram. Angles next to each other. So these two or these two.
180.
180. Consecutives are 180, right? And that goes all the way around. Okay, last thing about a parallelogram is if we draw the diagonals in, what happens?
They're equal.
The parts are equal, right? They bisect each other. So that means that this little piece here is the same as that piece, and this piece is the same as that piece. Okay, here's where it gets to be a lot, because all of that stuff that we just drew for the parallelogram is true of every one of these figures, right? So a rectangle has all of this, and a rhombus has all of that. So we're not going to mark it on them, or you won't be able to see anything. But just know that everything at the top is true of the things below, okay? What is a rectangle?
It's a square but longer.
A square but longer. It has to have 4 right angles. That's all that is required for a rectangle, right? Is 4 right angles. A parallelogram with 4 right angles. So that's a rectangle. Do you remember the theorem that we said about rectangles?
No.
It was their diagonals. What do you know about the diagonals of a rectangle? They're the same. Okay?
Isn't that also the same thing for a trapezoid?
Yes, the diagonals are congruent in a trapezoid. The difference is in a trapezoid, if you look at this, these pieces aren't equal. But in a rectangle, those pieces are equal now. But the whole thing is equal to the whole thing for both of them. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that's rectangle. That means all of this is true and this is true, right? What's a rhombus?
It's like a angled square.
It has 4 congruent sides, right? It's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. Okay, we learned 2 theorems about a rhombus, and they both dealt with the diagonals. Do you remember?
I don't know.
If I draw the diagonals of a rhombus in, what happens with the angles? They're perpendicular. Okay, so that's the first one. We know these will all be 90. And then what do you know about opposite angles? They bisect, right? The diagonals bisect. So that means all 4 of these are the same. And it means all 4 of these are the same. Okay, that's a rhombus. What's a square?
No, not they both.
4 right angles.
4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. Okay, here it is. Are you ready? You don't have to draw a single thing on the square because the square is all of this put together. If you take all that information, it's a square. Okay? Diagonals are perpendicular. Diagonals will bisect. Diagonals bisect bisect each other. Consecutives are supplementary. Opposites are congruent. All those things. Why are we talking about a stranger walking by?
We're admiring
I like
his
his
hat.
hat. Sorry.
I like
Great.
his coat. I like his
Any questions on any of that?
He is
Okay,
not
so
a
here's the deal. Here's the deal.
Bro, he looks like a brother.
All of this information is what you need to know for your next test. Okay? Not the quiz. The quiz is only going to focus on this information. Okay? But your test is all of this put together, which is a lot of information, right? So we have a lot of review to do before we get there. Make sure you are with me for that, not holding hands with your neighbor and being distracted.
Why do you always put that?
Why you holding hands up?